Hello and welcome to my December wrap-up. I read 22 books in December and DNF'd another 3, which I will include at the end of this video. So instead of having a long preamble introduction, I'm just gonna start talking because I have a lot to get through. December was a very weird month for me, and because of that, I had some weird reading, but that's fine. I got a lot done, and I got 10 books off of my shelf, so that's very exciting. The first book that I read in December was Better Than Perfect, which is the first book in the Wildcard series by Simone Elkeles. This is a new adult slash young adult, they're still in high school, romance novel about 2 teenagers who fall in love. Derek and Ashton. Ashton has just been voted captain of her football team, and Derek is her older sister's stepson, and her older sister comes to live with them for a little while, and they kind of hit it off. Again, lots more nuance going on here, but that's the general gist of this. I gave it 3 stars. It was fine. Like, it was one of those books that, like, it satisfied the vibe I was going for, so I was quite happy with it, but I don't know if it was necessarily, like, a fantastic book. Like, it was kind of cliche, it was kind of over the top. There were some cringy bits, like, at one point, Ashton was, like, administering first aid to Derek after he gets beaten up, and said something about, like, her female instincts were kicking in, which was weird, but I don't know, it was a fun time. Like, it wasn't terrible, it entertained me, it was really easy to get through because I really did just want romance novel, so I was happy with that. And I did root for the main characters to get together, which, to be honest, is like the main thing in romance novels. Like, I need to want the main characters to be together because otherwise there's 0 point in me reading it. Like, if I'm not rooting for the main characters, I don't care. And I was here. Like, I did want Derek and Ashton to be together. Like, I was rooting for them. They were a cute couple. And there were a lot of, like, cute background things going on. And I really liked the way football was handled. They're both football players, and I thought it was handled really well. So yeah, it was fun. I will say too much of this book was spent on, like, the will they, won't they aspect of the relationship. Just, like, going so hard for that, which, like, can work sometimes, but in here it was just like, you have these 2 teenagers who are so incredibly into each other, and they both know that the other is into them as well, and it's just like, I can't buy into the will they, won't they at all, because they obviously will. They both want to, they both plan to, they just, like, I don't know, there's too much will they, won't they for, like, what the book was, but it was fun. Like, if you want, like, a super romancy, young adult, new adult thing, I wouldn't say this was a bad one. It entertained me. Then I read The Coincidence of Callie and Kayden, which is the first in the Coincidence series, I guess is what it's called, according to Goodreads, by Jessica Sorensen. I gave this 2 stars. This is another new adult romance novel. This is about 2 teenagers in college. One of them was sexually abused as a kid, and then one of them was physically abused by a parent. It's a romance novel. They get together, and it's a lot of just like, oh, look at these sad, fragile, broken people who find love and heal each other, and that was kind of the gist of this book. I did not enjoy this at all. This was very unpleasant to read. It was way over the top. Like, I like drama and tragedy, and, like, I'm down with sad books, but, like, you have to actually deal with the sadness and with the tragic things. Like, it has to be developed. It has to be a part of the character. You have to deal with the trauma, and it just felt very, very shallow, and just like it existed solely to make these characters sad and broken and desperate for each other, and, like, they didn't have personalities outside of that. Like, the one girl was just sexually abused as a kid, and the boy was just physically abused, and, like, that was it. Like, that was the extent of their characters and, like, their entire personalities, and, like, there was no time spent actually dealing with the traumatic events of their past. It was just like, oh, they love each other because they're both so broken in such similar ways, and it was so frustrating. And I also really hated the ending, which I probably wouldn't complain about just because I really dislike this book so much regardless of that, but for a romance novel, even when I'm not enjoying, I want there to be a happily ever after or a happily for now. Like, either one. It's a series, so, like, I don't expect it to be, like, completely ended. Like, whatever. It doesn't have to have complete closure. It's a series, whatever. But this had no ending, like, at all. This was such a short book, and it's part of a series, so I get the vibe that this was, like, the first half of a novel, and she just, like, instead of combining and writing one normal length novel, she just cut the novel in half and published it separately. Like, that was the vibe I get. There was no conclusion to this book. It just, like, stopped in the middle of a dramatic scene. Like, there was no closure, there was no ending. It just, like, I don't know, it just kind of stopped in the scene, and, like, I guess enjoy in the next book if you pick it up. Like, I don't know, like, I don't expect, like, complete closure. Again, it's a series, but, like, I expect, like, oh, hey, we have, like, gotten over, like, the first of our problems. We've, like, solved this small problem, at least, so we are, like, having a happy moment. And then, like, there is much more to come. Like, that's all I want, you know? And it was wild not to get even that. It just, like, a lot of people were complaining about this ending. It was weird. I've never read a romance novel that just, like, stopped like that. But this was kind of unpleasant to read. Like, if you're gonna have characters who've been, like, raped and abused, then actually deal with that trauma of the rape and abuse. But yeah, this was not fun. And then I read Tempting Fate by Jane Green, which I gave 1 star, and I promise I do have, like, more positive things to say later in this video. Like, it's not all going to be, like, negative. I just had a rough start to December, so if you want more positive things, like, skip along a little bit. But this is an adult contemporary novel about a middle-aged woman, Gabby, who has been happily married to her husband Elliot for 18 years, and they have 2 teenage daughters. And one day she's at the bar with some of her girlfriends, and she meets a very cute, very young, like 30-ish guy who is into her, and they start up a flirtation, and then he goes, like, back to his side of the country, and they kind of email each other for a little bit, and then the flirtation turns into a little bit more, and they have a very brief affair, and she gets pregnant, you know, after the affair has concluded. So this is just kind of dealing with the ramifications of her affair and kind of what that has to do with everything. And yeah, 1 star. One of the worst things I've read this year. I think this is my 3rd 1-star book of the year, and it was bad. This is one of those books that it's not that everything in it was necessarily so terrible. I mean, there were some bad things, but, like, I've read books I hated more. But this book had no redeeming qualities. Like, the only positive thing I can say about this is that it was a very, very quick read. I read it in, like, 2 hours, and it's more than 300 pages. So, not fun. I thought this was going to be a really nuanced, like, complex look at a woman who cheats on her husband even though she thinks she's in a happy marriage and has, like, a happy life. And instead, this was one of the most superficial things I've read. She feels old. That's why she cheats on him. And it tells you that from the beginning. And then it just kind of is like, oh, like, she still kind of feels old, so she cheats on him. And, like, that is as deep as this book goes. It was so unpleasant. And then at the ending, it has, like, this heartwarming ending, which is completely at odds with the rest of this book. Like, these characters don't actually reach their heartwarming ending. They don't, like, grow to get there. It's just kind of like everyone's unhappy, and then they stop, and then they're just like, oh, I guess I'm fine with this situation. And everybody's happy in the end. And it just does not work. Like, you can have a happy ending after, like, bad things happening, but the characters have to actually do work to get there. Like, they have to earn that happy ending. They can't just, like, decide that after everything negative that's gone down, they're suddenly fine with it. Like, not a fan. I don't know. Like, I was down for, like, some interesting things to happen and, like, have interesting character development and complex feelings, and there was nothing. I could do a longer rant, but to be honest, after looking at my review, it's mostly just that this is shallow and a void of personality and nothing interesting, and not a fan, so would not recommend. This was the worst thing I read of the month, by far. So I had 3 DNFs, and this was still the worst thing I read of the month. And to be honest, I probably would have DNF'd this had it not been so quick to get through, but I was already, like, 2/3 through by the time I realized that it was just terrible. So I don't know, like, I don't know how you write a book about a woman who desperately wants to have a 3rd child. Her husband gets a vasectomy without telling her. she has an affair and gets pregnant with that desperately wanted third child. And it's just like, there is so much there to explore. And this book did nothing with that. Like, absolutely nothing. Then I read Pushing the Limits by Katie McGarry, which is another young adult romance novel. The two main characters, Noah and Echo, are in high school together. Noah's a foster kid who wants to reconnect with his brothers, but he's been labeled as angry and violent for beating up a previous foster father, so he doesn't have much contact with them. And Echo has a traumatic past that she has repressed, and she's covered in scars because of something that happened that she cannot remember. I gave this 3 stars. This too was a little bit trauma dumping, just like the Jessica Sorensen book, The Coincidence of Callie and Kayden. This was also a little bit like trauma dumping to like abused characters who are broken and find each other and are desperate to heal each other in their brokenness. But it was handled a lot better. I will say Noah, the male main character, was super cool. I liked his storyline. I liked the way it dealt with his his biological brothers who were in a different foster home. And he's 17 turning 18 and he wants to age out. He wants to like get his own place and take his brothers back. It was really like emotionally touching and like, I'm not gonna say the best handled thing in the world, but pretty well handled. And like, I don't know, but his story was making me teary-eyed. I don't have positive things to say about Echo's story. That was very much over the top. But whatever, like, I was in it for Noah's story by that point in the book, so I just kind of didn't really care about her very much. It needed more time at the end to wrap things up, but that was fine. I really liked the writing style. Like, it kept me absorbed, it kept me interested. I was like down, to be honest, I almost read a second one of her books, but I was just like kind of not wanting to read any more romance with high schoolers, especially because in this book they did feel so young. Like, I don't know, like, there's only so much I can read about teenagers who are hot for each other. So that was kind of like, I might have enjoyed this book more had it been the first one, but it was just kind of like 3 stars, mediocre, it was fine. Had this been the first one, I probably would have read more Katie McGarry though. So I would recommend this if you're more into like high school romances, but I'm almost 30. 3 was maybe a little bit past my limit there. But yeah, the only other thing that was really cringe for me was that I cannot stand when characters, especially in a romance novel, just can't use the word sex, especially like when they're into each other and having sex. Or I mean, like, they weren't actually in this book, but like they were talking about it and they just like could not say the word sex. Like, if you cannot say sex, you should not be having it or discussing having it. Like, you are not there yet, just like chill. But it was fine. It was a good book. Like, I would recommend if you're into this kind of thing. I don't know. I enjoyed it okay. Then I read Between the Tides by Patti, Callahan, Henry, which I gave 2 stars. This is an adult contemporary novel about the main character, Catherine, had a childhood trauma. A little boy that she was very close friends with drowned when she was supposed to be watching him, so she blames herself. And now, as an adult, she has to return to this, like, I think seaside town or riverside town, whatever, to spread her father's ashes. So it deals a lot with like the grief she has for her father and also her dealing with this continued childhood trauma that she's never quite dealt with because her family moved away like so soon after it happened. Did not enjoy this one. Again, lots of potential, interesting premise. There was so much she could have done with this premise, and instead it was like the most self-absorbed narcissistic thing I've ever read. Like, here's the thing. When the main character was 12, she was supposed to be watching this little boy. He drowned. As a 12-year-old, she was very self-absorbed about this grief, which I understand. She put herself before his mother, which I understand. She was 12. And it was like, she was upset about leaving, and she thought, like, when she saw the mother of this drowned boy crying, that the mother was also upset about her leaving town. That's fine for a 12-year-old. When she was in her 30s, she was still thinking those things. She was like, the mother of this drowned boy did a painting called, like, The Last Night, and it's like a painting of the river where he drowned, and she keeps thinking that it's about her and her leaving town, and I am like, you are in your 30s, how are you possibly this self-absorbed? Like, I was fine with that when she was 12 because, like, children are self-absorbed. They don't have a whole lot of empathy for others a lot of the time, and that's fine. But as an adult, she needed to have grown out of that. Like, it was so frustrating to read that she just had zero self-awareness. And, like, I get that Catherine is the main character of this book, so it's like, of course, we're, like, centering the book around Catherine and Catherine's feelings. But you can do that while not, like, belittling the feelings of someone who's grieving a whole lot more. Like, both things can exist within the same book. Not a fan of this. Did I have any other thoughts? Oh, there's a lot of melodrama. Oh my god, the melodrama. I'd forgotten about that. I read this early in the month, in case it's not clear. I don't remember many of these books. That's why I keep looking down at my computer. There is literally a scene in this where she runs after her ex-boyfriend and is like, oh my god, like, I'm sprinting after his car to keep him from leaving me. And, like, he turns around and comes back and he's like, oh my god, I'm so sorry for leaving. And, like, y'all are literally in your 30s. Like, you are too old for this. And then I don't like the bad boyfriend trope. Like, I don't like when a character has a boyfriend that has nothing to do with the story and they just suck, so that when the character dumps them to be with the person they're supposed to be with, you don't feel bad or weird about this. Like, her boyfriend had nothing to do with this book. Like, he was barely in the book. He was off doing his own thing, cheating on her, whatever, I don't remember. I assume he was cheating on her. That's usually what they do. Just so that when she dumps him at the end of the book to go off with the guy she's supposed to be with, you're not feeling bad for him. And it's just like, why? Like, why waste space doing that when he has nothing to do with the book anyway? Just, like, write him out. I don't know. I'm not a fan of this book. This book didn't do anything. Like, there were so many interesting concepts and it just did literally nothing with anything. So, very frustrating. Do not recommend. Then I read 7 Days of Us by Francesca Hornak, which is an adult contemporary novel about a pandemic. Not COVID. This was released in, 2017? So that's lovely. Essentially, this family is quarantined around Christmas time because one of their daughters has been in Africa treating a fictional disease, which I think is styled after Ebola, but is fictional so that the author can just make the symptoms whatever she wants. And then, yeah, she comes home and this kind of dysfunctional family is all together in quarantine for 7 days. And that's kind of it. I give this 2 stars. It's a holiday book, and it is described as funny by a lot of people on the back. Like, it is hilariously funny, according to Rosamund Lupton. It is warm and humane, funny and sad, according to Marion Keyes. This book is laugh out loud funny, according to Kristen Beverly. Like, I didn't get the funny in this book. It was, like, dark at times. It was bitter. It was condescending. It was very, very tragically sad. I did not get the funny. But I don't get funny in a lot of books, so maybe that was me. I just, like, there was a pandemic going on. People were dying. There was, like, a dysfunctional family dynamic. There was a son that the dude didn't know he had, and then, like, the son comes back into their lives, and there's a death, and, like, it's a very sad book, and I don't know. Apparently it was funny. The character development was really flat. Like, the characters were kind of nothing as people. And it's not that the characters themselves were shallow, although some of them were. It was more that just, like, they had no character development and very little personality. They were just, like, the bare minimum required in order to be characters, which made the whole book kind of fall flat. And there were so many coincidences. Just, like, people, like, running into each other in, like, incredibly absurd situations over and over again. Like, the son that the father doesn't know he has is flying in from America, and he runs into the father's wife at the airport, and they just get to chatting and tell each other all their secrets, because apparently that's what you do with airport strangers. And I don't know, it happened like 5 different times in this book where they would just randomly run into people in completely ridiculous ways. Like, the most unlikeliest of coincidences. It was very frustrating. I don't like that. I like for my books to feel real, and this did not feel real. but if it's supposed to be funny, maybe I just missed all the humor in this. I don't know. It did keep me entertained. I gave it 2 stars. Like, for all that I disliked a lot of the elements of this, I was entertained enough to keep reading. So I'll give it that. And if it's supposed to be funny, maybe I just missed the humor. And if you see the humor, you would enjoy this a lot more than me. But I did not really enjoy much about this, unfortunately. Then I read Wanderlust by Roni Loren, which is a new adult romance novel about a girl who's, well, I shouldn't say a girl, a young woman who's a journalist who is assigned to cover the lead singer of a very famous rock band as a new assignment, and they fall in love. I gave this 2 stars. I was going to give it 3 stars because I didn't hate a lot about it, but as I was writing my review, I realized my review was almost entirely negative, and I was like, I don't actually feel that fondly towards this book. But, like, it was fine. Like, it kept me reading. It wasn't very long. Maybe that was why, like, maybe if it'd been longer, I would have liked it less, but maybe it was just short enough that I was like, I don't care. Got through it really fast, didn't think about it much. But yeah, it was a little fun. Like, it was flawed, very, very flawed. I'll get into that. But it was a fun read. Like, I was down for the romance. I wanted them to be together. Like, I don't know, the rockstar thing was kind of cool. There were way too many miscommunications and random fights that were just, like, resolved without even a conversation. They would just, like, scream at each other for, like, oh my god, I can't believe you did this to me, and then walk away, and then, like, the next day they'd come back and be like, yeah, sorry, I overreacted. We're cool. And it's like, you don't even, like, have to have a conversation to fix the issue. Like, why? I don't know. There was way too much of that for how short this book was. And, like, the fights were just for literally nothing. Like, why? Like, maybe once or twice, sure, they can get upset with each other, but then it just kind of seemed like they had irrational anger issues at a point. I was also super uncomfortable with the fact that the first time they had any kind of sexual experience together, the one girl was so drunk that she was barely involved. Like, the journalist girl. Like, she was absolutely out of her mind, wasted when they're having the sexual encounter. And, like, the dude stops eventually because he's like, oh, like, she's too drunk for this. But the point at which he stopped was already way too far. Like, I don't understand. Like, they wanted each other. Like, why did you have to make her absolutely, like, blackout wasted for this to happen? Like, they could have just had sex and enjoyed it. Like, I don't know. I didn't like that. It was a little bit rapey. And it was even commented on in the book that it was a little bit rapey, and he was like, it's weird that no one is like, because he was walking her through a hotel, and he's like, it's weird that, like, the limo driver and none of, like, the hotel employees are stopping me with this, like, obviously wasted girl who doesn't know what's going on, but it kind of suits my purposes right now. And I'm like, that is rapey. There was also one, like, minor spoilery thing, but, like, to be honest, doesn't really matter. The main character, Aubrey, was driving drunk one night when she was younger, and her sister died in the car accident while she was driving, which was her fault. And there is something else that went on during that accident. The book acted like gave her some kind of, like, absolution there. She was like, oh, it wasn't entirely my fault. Like, there were other forces at play. But she was still driving drunk and crashed the car, and her sister died. And I'm like, I don't understand how this absolves you of any responsibility here. Like, it didn't change the fact that she was driving drunk and crashed the car and her sister died. Like, it was, like, such a minor thing, and they were acting like it was a huge deal, and it really wasn't, and that frustrated me. But that was basically it. The only other thing I had was the sex was really graphic in this book, which isn't my thing, and probably wouldn't have bothered me so much, except that this book was already so short. Like, it was, like, let me check how long it was. 191 pages. It was 191 pages, and there were so many sex scenes, and they were so long and so graphic that it was just, like, I was skimming them, because, like, I don't really care, but I'll read, like, I don't mind reading a book that has graphic sex scenes, because I can skim through them. But it was just, like, such a short book that there was so little plot outside of the sex scenes. So, like, that was just kind of, like, a not for me thing. And I probably wouldn't have picked it up had I known that in advance. But 2 stars. It wasn't, like, a terrible book. It was just, like, there were so many things I didn't like about it that I couldn't justify giving it 3. Unfortunately. And I swear this is the last of the negative reviews before I get into something that I actually liked. The Lemon Orchard by Luanne Rice. This is an adult contemporary novel about a woman whose daughter and husband were killed in a car accident like 5 years earlier, and she has now moved across the country and is managing an orchard, like kind of house sitting the orchard for her aunt and uncle. And she meets the manager of the orchard, Roberto, who is a Mexican immigrant who also lost his daughter 5 years previous, and they start up a romance and kind of look for Roberto's daughter to find out what happened to her, because he lost her on the way from Mexico to the United States. I gave this 2 stars. I was really down for this book when I thought it was going to be a story about 2 grieving parents who lost their children, and like, I was down for that. And then at a point it was just like, just kidding, this is all just white savior trope. Like, the entire book, Roberto has 0 agency to do anything. Julia is just like constantly doing things behind his back and like helping out the poor Mexican immigrant who doesn't have access to anything and doesn't know how to like look for people and find his daughter, and she's doing it all for him. And like, it was very much treated like that in the book. Like, it was very, very cringy. And at a point it even forgets that Julia has her own tragedy. Like, it stopped, I feel like halfway through the book, it stopped mentioning her dead daughter, who she is like very sad about, who may or may not have killed herself in the car accident. It's kind of like unclear and unexplored, really. It's just like they forgot about that because Julia is looking for Roberto's daughter, and that is the only plot of this book. But like, you don't actually get to that plot until like halfway through. And there was so much random tangential stuff in this book. Like, there is the point of view of an old movie star who is like friends with Julia's family, and I don't know what his point of view added to the book. He's in love with Julia's aunt, who's not even in the book. She's like in France somewhere, and he's just in love with her, and that's his entire perspective, and like, it contributed nothing. Like, I do not understand. And then the ending was awful. There's no closure to the story at all. There's no closure to Julia and Roberto's relationship. There is nothing but white savior trope. Like, you know, if it was a story about her helping him find his daughter, that would have been fine. Like, sure, like, if you care for someone, find their daughter. But like, there was no development of their relationship. There was no development of their characters. There was nothing except, oh look, the white lady's helping the poor Mexican immigrant. And there was also like no discussion of anything. And then, I don't know, the ending was a little bit too like slapped on for me. And then it just kind of like stopped. It was like, hey, here's the conclusion to one small part of this book, and everything else is just like, doesn't matter. It was very frustrating. Did not enjoy. But that was the last of the negative ones, at least for a minute, because then I read some books I actually enjoyed, and we're already like a half hour into this video, so like, kudos to me in my fantastic reading month of December. I read Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby, which is an adult thriller action-y mystery book. It's about 2 fathers whose sons were both murdered. Their sons were gay, the fathers are very homophobic and like had estranged relationships with their sons as a result. And it's kind of about the fathers deciding that they're going to avenge their sons. They're going to be better parents in death than they were when their sons were alive. And it's about them kind of confronting their homophobia and trying to become better people in a way. Very interesting. 4 stars. I also did not realize it was set in my hometown of Richmond, Virginia, which was awesome. And like, something I don't think a lot of other people will get so much is like the sense of place that you have in this book. Like, I've read other books set in Richmond, but I've never read a book that just like had so many like vibes. Like, it vibed like Richmond. It just captured so much in like such small ways, and like, it was fantastic. Like, it's not just that he's from here, but he did a really, really wonderful job of capturing the setting, and it was like gorgeously done. Like, I love that. Like, I'm going to read everything he writes now because it was just so good. Negatives, I think this book was a little too actiony for my taste. It was like over the top kind of explosions, gunfights, whatever, which is just like what the book is. That's not a bad thing. That's just like not to my taste. I like smaller, like less dramatic, like more down to earth type things, and this was very much like over the top. But if you like that kind of thing, like, for sure you will probably like it in this book. It just wasn't to my taste, but everything else was great. I loved the character development. Like, the difference of me talking about this book when I'm actually like stoked on it and have things to say versus like everything I've talked about so far, this book was wonderful. The character development was so good. I loved the main characters, and just like they were so complex and had so much growth throughout the book. And it wasn't like fake growth where they started out bad people and became good people. It was like you could see them changing, you could see them confronting themselves, you could see them being like, I was a bad parent to him, and still continue on with their homophobia. And you could see them like actually growing beyond that, but still having flaws, like still being flawed people in with their growth. Like, it was so good. Like, they felt like such real people. Like the character growth is really where it was at with this book for me. It was so good. My only other negative, the writing style was a little bit abrupt for me. Like, just like the sentence structure and everything, I think it just felt like a little bit abrupt. Like, I just wanted it to be a little bit smoother, and I probably would have like been fully absorbed, but like it was still fantastic. The writing was great, the characters were amazing, the setting was great. Like, I highly recommend. Like, this book was super like graphic and gory and like violent, but if you like that kind of thing, like, I would highly recommend this so much. This was fantastic, and I will definitely be reading more from S.A. Cosby. Then I read Behind Closed Doors by Susan R. Sloan, which is an adult contemporary drama slash kind of a little bit thrillery, but not quite, about a woman who's in an abusive relationship. She marries the guy, has kids. It follows like 40 years of her life, and it opens with the prologue of her being on trial for her husband's murder. And then you kind of go back like 45 years into the past when they first meet as teenagers, and you get to see their whole relationship, their family. You get to see her losing all of her children, basically. And like, I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I think this gets kind of negative reviews, which I understand. It did feel a little flat. Like, it was the kind of book that had such a wide scope, and it wasn't like long enough. Like, I have it here. It looks like a thick book, and it is, but like, it's covering like 45 years of their lives, of like this family, and it's just not long enough for that. So it did feel like super flat, really. But like, I enjoyed what it was doing so much. I love like long sagas like that, where you just delve into the characters and like how they got where they are. And like, this whole book is just about the character growth and development, and you see this family grow and change, and like these children go from like toddlers to like fully formed adults with flaws and like their own traumas. And I just love that conceptually. So like, even though I don't think this book was like the most amazingly well done thing, it was really, really enjoyable because it's the kind of thing that I like a lot. My only other negative was kind of that the final third lost me a little bit. Like, it wasn't that it got bad, it just got a little bit too like melodramatic, over the top, trying to include just like a lot of excitement. And like, this was not really an exciting book. It didn't need to be exciting. It was just like this very slow family study, which was really cool to me. And then it kind of lost that a little bit towards the end, and it also kind of like changed perspective a little bit. It focused more on one of her children than like the main character herself. But it was really interesting. If you like books like that, this was fine. I mean, I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. But it's one of those books that like, it was flawed, but it was for me, and I had a good time. Then I read Keeper, One House, 3 Generations, and a Journey into Alzheimer's by Andrea Gillies. This is a nonfiction book about a woman whose mother and father-in-law come to live with her and her husband, and the mother-in-law has dementia, Alzheimer's specifically, and it's just about how she becomes the primary caregiver and what her experience was like. Being the primary caregiver for someone with Alzheimer's, and how difficult it was. I gave this 3 stars. I have personal experience with this myself. My grandmother came to live with my family when I was in my late teens. She had dementia. I don't remember of what sort. I wasn't her primary caregiver, but like, I was there a lot doing caregiving. So this book really did hit close to home. And like, while I was reading it, I was not really enjoying the process, because it is just very like sad. It's like depressing and like dark and just like dreary, because it's just like, it's not a good thing. Like, it's not an enjoyable process, and it's not like there's growth to be had from this. Like, she is losing her mind, she's losing herself. Like, there's nothing you can do to like make things better, and it's, I don't know, like, reading this book was not a good process. But the more space I get from having read it, the more glad I am that I did read it, because I think it was very interesting. I think it offered a lot. It gives you a really good perspective on what it is like to live in that situation of like how frustrating it can be and how easy it is to lose your temper. And like, Andrea Gillies really paints herself in a negative light at points. Well, I don't want to say like truly negative, but like, she reacts badly sometimes because she is stressed, she's overwhelmed, she's overworked. Like, she doesn't know how to do this. Like, she's not a caregiver, like, she's not a nurse. Like, this is not her job, you know, and it just kind of gets thrown on her, and she struggles a lot, and you get to really see that because it's like such a difficult thing. It was very interesting. So I would recommend this if you're interested, because I do think it was really well done. It's just like not an enjoyable read, and maybe like I enjoy having read it more than I enjoyed reading it, if that makes sense. But it was very worthwhile. Then I read We Were Never Here by Andrea Bartz. This is a thriller, an adult contemporary thriller about a girl who goes traveling abroad with her best friend. And when they are in Peru, I think, her best friend kills a man because she says that man was trying to rape her. And this is not the first time that they have killed a man traveling abroad. So it just kind of deals with that and the toxic female friendship. I gave this 3 stars. I gave this 3 stars, apparently. I barely read a review for this book, and I barely remember it. It was generic, it was bland, it was a toxic female friendship, and that was pretty much like, I feel like that's a trendy thing right now, or in the past couple of years, and it just wasn't like, this book offered nothing new. Like, I feel like if you really like the toxic female friendship trope, sure, give this a shot, but it was just like so mediocre and nothing, and I did not have a good time. I don't remember this. Like, I have nothing to say for this review because I finished this on December 17th and I don't remember it. The only thing I wrote down was that some of the plot twists at the end were kind of cool, but like, I don't really remember them. And I read this 2 weeks ago, so I don't know how cool they were, but like, it wasn't a terrible book. It was fine. It was just like so forgettable. Then I read The Somnambulist by Jonathan Barnes, which is the first book in the Domino Men series. This is a historical fantasy / sci-fi novel. I don't really know what genre it's in. I think I tagged it as fantasy, so let's go with that. It's about a man who was a magician and had an assistant who was called the Somnambulist, who was not a true person. He could like be stabbed and not bleed. Like, you could like repeatedly stab him and he'd just be fine. And he was also really big and strong and never spoke. And then there's like this underground cult that is trying to take over the world because reasons. I really don't know how to explain this. I gave it 3 stars, and it's weird because the plot was so basic. Like, they're trying to uncover a plot to like overthrow England and the world eventually. And like, that is like the entire basicness of this book. But it was so weird that I don't know how to describe it. It was like one of those books that just like constantly asked questions and then gave you 0 answers to deal with those questions. It was weird. Like, The Somnambulist is the title of this book. He was not the main character. I don't know what he was. I don't know what he did. I don't know what his role in this book was. I don't know anything about him. Like, I can't even begin to describe him. And like, there was another character who was like kind of Benjamin Button-esque, but also like traveling through time as he was Benjamin Buttoning, which was weird. And that was never dealt with. It was just kind of dropped at a point. And like, there's so much you could have done with that because that's such a weird thing, and like nothing was done with it. And I don't know. There were like at one point these 2 English schoolboys who were like magical assassin things. Like, they might have been demons. They might have been not demons. I don't know. I don't know what they were. I don't know what this book was. I gave it 3 stars because it kept my interest, and it was just like so weird that I like couldn't look away. But I don't know that it was very good. Like, I was reading reviews on this and I found myself agreeing a lot more with the negative reviews than I did with anything positive about it. It was just so messy and jumbled and weird for the sake of being weird without actually like doing anything with it. I wouldn't recommend, but it was also like interesting enough that I was down for the ride. So I don't know, not the worst thing I've ever read, but like I don't think I would really recommend this, and I'm definitely not reading the sequel. Do you ever just film for like 45 minutes and realize you're only halfway through your wrap up? Because same. Then I read By the Pricking of My Thumbs by Agatha Christie, which is yet another Agatha Christie book that I've been trying to read. This is the fourth Tommy and Tuppence book. They essentially visit a great aunt in a nursing home, and then Tuppence becomes kind of enamored with one of the other old women in the nursing home, and then that old woman disappears, and Tuppence decides she must find her. I gave this 3 stars. I do actually like Tommy and Tuppence. Not as much as Miss Marple, but they weren't as annoying as Perot. So, a nice middle ground here, I feel like. The first half of this book was so boring. Like, I had the hardest time keeping focused on this. I had an entire morning that I spent trying to read this book, and I only got halfway through, and like, it's not a very long book. I always wanted to be reading other things. I always wanted to be doing other things. I just like kept doom scrolling on my phone to avoid this book. And then the second half was very exciting and fun. Like, the first half was 2 stars, the second half was 4 stars. So like, it averaged out as 3. The second half was probably the best Agatha Christie that I've ever read. It was really, really fun. I like the drama, I like the mystery. It was a lot more complex than Agatha Christie usually is, I feel like. Like, there was a lot more going on. It was a lot wider in scope. It was just cool. So, I'm not sure I would really recommend this, but like, the second half was good, so it wasn't a complete loss. And then the first audiobook that I actually managed to finish this month, because it was a lengthy audiobook, was Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty by Patrick Radden Keefe. This is a nonfiction book about the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma, which was the family that basically, or the company, I guess, that engineered OxyContin and kind of like pushed forward the opioid epidemic. Like, I don't want to blame them completely, but like, let's be real, they have some responsibility. But this book is basically just like a deep dive into the family, like going back to the 1920s, you know, and like covering 3 generations of the family, like the whole lifespan of Purdue Pharma, and just like everything that went along with that. It was absolutely fascinating. I gave this 4 stars. Like, there was just so much information, and it was so well researched and so well done, and I really, really enjoyed it. Like, I don't really know how to review this book because it's just like a deep dive into the Sackler family. So if you're interested in that, like, at all, highly recommend. Like, this was fantastic. Like, I was stoked every time I was driving in the car listening to this. It was just one of those books I was always like really, really excited to get to. It was so good. I just like really, really enjoyed it. I don't know how to review it. How do you review nonfiction that's just like good? Like, it was well written. The audiobook was fantastic. Like, highly recommend. If you have like a lengthy commute and like listening to stuff like this was perfect. My only real negative was that sometimes the book did feel like it was a little bit choppy, and I feel like that's just probably because of the information that Keefe had. You know, when he's talking about people from the 20s, like, he's trying to like, he only has so much access to information. Like, it was probably just a lack of information that like he couldn't include everything and answer all my questions because like that information just isn't available, which is fine. But it was a fantastic book. Like, I would highly recommend. It was so interesting to learn about the company, about the family, about just like the FDA and all the messed up stuff they did in addition to like the company doing messed up stuff. It was so fascinating. Like, 10 out of 10. I mean, well, I guess 8 out of 10. I gave it 4 stars, but it was a really wonderful book. Like, for me, this was the absolute standout of the month. The only thing I will add is that if you're looking for something about the opioid epidemic itself, this book is not that. It is very much about the family, about the Sacklers, not so much about the opioid epidemic. So like, that's just not the topic of this book. It's kind of like in the periphery, but that's not the subject, so that's fine. This was also recommended by Overbooked. Oh, forgot to mention that, but she read this a few months back and really enjoyed it, I think. But I really, really loved it. Then I read The Lies I Tell by Julie Clark, which was another adult thriller about a con artist and a journalist who is investigating the con artist. And essentially you get the con artist's whole life from like teenage years to adulthood now, where she's trying to take down a senator, governor, politician of some sort, who's also a real estate guy, and the journalist whose life was indirectly ruined by the con artist. And now she's trying to take down the con artist while the con artist is taking down the real estate developer. So it's kind of a funny circle. I don't usually like con artist stories, but I gave this 4 stars. I thought this was really well done. I feel like this is really in contrast to the last thriller I talked about, which I've already forgotten what it was called. Whoops. But it's like you take a concept that's kind of trendy, kind of bland, but you don't do anything necessarily different or interesting with it. You just develop the characters and the story so well that it becomes interesting and different. Like, there is nothing about this book that is wildly out there from any other con artist story that's going on right now, because it is a very trendy thriller topic at the moment. But like, it was so well done and so well developed, and all the characters were such real people with full personalities that like, I was so down for the ride. Like, if you develop your characters, that's like 90% of what you need to have a good thriller, for me anyway, like for what I enjoy. Like, it was such a good time. Like, I was invested from start to finish. The only real issue I had with this was that some of the cons themselves, like the actual cons that she was running, seemed a little bit like underbaked. Like, the book was written like she spent months and months doing research and like planning these cons and like planning for like every possibility, and like when you actually like saw them, it felt like, who's really falling for this? Like, not a fancy politician real estate developer who has lawyers on speed dial. Like, he's not falling for this. Like, not this super wealthy CEO who wants to hide like millions of dollars of money. Like, I don't know, like if you think about like average ordinary people, maybe, but she was kind of targeting like high profile clients, and it's like, I just couldn't buy that all of these people were falling for these like very basic underdeveloped cons. It just seemed very coincidental and way too easy. But that was fine, because I love the characters, and like, if I'm into the characters, then kind of the rest of the book falls into place a lot for me. But I really enjoyed this, so would recommend. Then I read The Night Swim by Megan Goldin, which was recommended to me by Ashley Bundy. This is an adult thriller about a podcaster who has a very famous true crime podcast. It's very popular. And each season she tackles a different case. In this case, she is tackling an ongoing trial about a teenage girl who was raped by a teenage boy. And at the same time, she's also investigating a murder from like 30 years earlier. I gave this 4 stars. This was a really well done book. Like, it was so interesting. I loved all the characters. Like, they were such interesting, well-developed people. All the situations were really well developed. It was just like so good. And I love the dual timeline, because so often in thrillers the dual timeline just seems like an easy way to throw in like 2 different stories to like keep it more interesting, and like I wind up being more connected to one than the other. But this was just so interesting and so well tied together. Like, it felt so cohesive, and they flowed, and it was like one continuous story, even though like the 2 actual events weren't really related at all. It was just so good. Like, I love when they can tie in events like that. Like, this was just a fantastic thriller. It is like really obvious, like the ending. Like, you kind of get that like by a third of the way through the book. Like, you know how it's gonna end. But like, that's fine, because it's such a good ride, and it's such fun getting there. Like, it's just a good time. Like, I love books that are a good time, and I love thrillers that take you along for the ride. And it's like, maybe it's not about like guessing the ending or being surprised, but it's about like the ride and the characters and like what's going on with their lives. And it was just like really, really enjoyable. The only thing I didn't really like about this was actually the podcast element. Like, I get that it gave her a reason to be in the town, to be an outsider who cared about these events, but it just didn't work for me, because this podcast just seemed like so under-researched. Like, she had nothing to add. She would skip out on the trial to like go to the courthouse and look up things that were unrelated to what she was talking about in the podcast. So she just like wouldn't have anything for her podcast sometimes, and it showed like excerpts of the podcast, and it was basically just her like ruminating for 2 or 3 minutes on like, wow, this girl says she was raped and like rape culture is a thing. And like that was it. Like there was no research, there was no depth. It's like I don't understand how this is like a popular podcast. It was just nothing. And like I assume they were excerpts, but they were kind of written like this was the whole podcast episode, but it'd be like 2 to 3 pages. I was like, this is either the shortest, worst podcast in existence, or you're just showing me like worthless excerpts from it. Like, and it was weird because she'd have like interesting interviews with people and get like really cool quotes and then not use those interviews or quotes at all in the podcast. And it just, I don't know, like that element was just so underdeveloped in the book that like I don't really understand why it was included at all. It kind of made the book a little less for me, but everything else was so well done and really good that I would highly recommend this anyway. Then I read And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. There are like 10 people who are called to an island. They all get mysterious letters from like various people that trick them into coming to this island, and then they get left there and people start dying one by one. It's very popular. I feel like I don't really have to explain the plot. And the whole thing is basically just like you try to guess like what's going on, who's committing the murders and why. They all have deep dark secrets and have all been accused of killing someone in one direct or indirect way. I gave this 3 stars. This has so far been my favorite Agatha Christie. It was a really fun ride. I don't know. Like I was instantly engrossed in this. It was fun to follow along. It was a cool puzzle. The characters are kind of nothing. They're just like ideas of people. They're a handful of characteristics thrown together. Like there's the old uptight religious woman, and that's basically all there is to her. You know, they were all kind of like that, which was frustrating. And there was so much time spent explaining things in this book. Like they would just pause the story randomly to sit and discuss the very obvious things that have just happened. Like I got it. I don't need it spoon-fed to me every 5 seconds. But like even so, it was a fun book. Like this is the first time I feel like I've gotten the Agatha Christie thing. Like it wasn't like my favorite thing ever, but this was the first book where I was like, I understand why people like her. This was a fun ride. Not an amazing ride, but a fun one. Then I listened to Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell, which was also recommended by Overbooked. This is a nonfiction book about linguistics and cults and kind of like how cults use language to kind of enthrall and keep their followers. I gave this 2 stars. To be honest, I'm not sure if I'm just being overly harsh on this book or not. It might just be that my disappointment by what I wanted this book to be and what it was were just like affected my enjoyment too much, and it's not actually that bad of a book, because it wasn't. It's just that like as I was reading this, I really thought going in this was going to be a deep dive into linguistics and like how cults use language and just like the linguistics of cults and like really go deep into the language of it, and it wasn't. Like, it was so basic when it came to linguistics. Like, I took 2.5 classes in college on linguistics, and I felt like I already knew everything that she included in this book. And like, I'm not an expert by any means. Like, I took 2 classes and dropped one. One of the classes I took, I failed. Like, I don't know much about linguistics. I just find it very, very interesting. And like, that's kind of my problem with this book, was that I felt like I wasn't getting anything that I didn't get from my intro to linguistics class in college. Like, I don't know, like it didn't really offer anything. And like, even beyond that, it was more about like just cults in general than it was like the language of them. Like, she spent a lot of time talking about like Jonestown and stuff, and like she like described what Jonestown was and who Jim Jones was and like what happened there. And it's like, okay, I get that, but it's like a very basic description. It's not even like a deep dive into it. It's just like information I already have, and then she talks like a tiny bit about language to go along with it, and then kind of moves on to a different topic. It was much more interesting when she was talking about like multi-level marketing, because she also talks about like cult, like religious cults like Jonestown and Scientology, and she also talks about like multi-level marketing and like kind of extremist fanatical athletic groups like SoulCycle and stuff like that, and CrossFit. And it was just like the multi-level marketing stuff was the most interesting by far. Like, I feel like that was what she was most interested in writing this book. And I feel like maybe if she'd written an entire book about MLMs, it might have been like a better, more interesting topic. But like as it was, this whole book was just kind of basic and bland and not well structured, and like I don't know, I didn't get anything out of it, and I was so excited because I love linguistics, so like it was just really, really disappointing, unfortunately. Then I read The Girls Who Went Away, The Hidden History of Women Who Surrendered Children for Adoption in the Decades Before Roe v. Wade by Ann Fessler. This is a nonfiction book about essentially adoption from 1945 to I think like 1972 or 3. And mostly focused on young unmarried women in their late teens, early 20s who surrendered children for adoption, who were often forced or bullied or coerced into giving their children up for adoption, many of whom didn't want to, many of whom didn't really know the consequences of it, and it kind of just deals with them and like the trauma that a lot of young women went through during these years, and basically how they were treated by society and the silence that was forced upon them because they weren't allowed to talk about it because of the shame. I gave this 4 stars. I did really enjoy this, more as like a concept than like the actual reading process. This book is mostly testimonials. Like when you read through it, it's mostly women explaining their own stories and just telling you in their own words, I think, what they went through and like what their life was like and what their specific situation was, which was great. Like it is very powerful to give a voice to people who have been silenced for so long, but at the same time, so many of these stories were so similar, which again, like there is power in that, but then it did get very repetitive. Like reading this as a book, it's like you're reading basically the same story over and over again. Like a young woman has sex, sometimes is raped, sometimes it's consensual, sometimes it's a boyfriend they love that they want to marry, sometimes it's not. Their family finds out and they get sent away to a home, have the child, don't want to give it up, but don't really have another choice, and then do, and then they feel sad for essentially the rest of their lives, and that trauma comes back to haunt them in many different ways. And it's a very sad story, and it's like everyone's story was different, but the broad strokes were all the same. And even when Ann Fessler was writing, her own writing was kind of dry and a little bit like dull and not that in-depth. Like I wanted more from this book, but at the same time I do like what she did. I do like that it was so many testimonials and just like her telling these women's stories and like what their lives was like and giving these women a platform. So I would highly recommend this, but I do think maybe it's better read in like small doses. Like read a chapter and then put it down for a while. Like don't try to like read the whole thing, because maybe it's like you can like fully experience each woman's individual story better that way. Because I do feel like they were running together a lot for me, and I didn't really enjoy that, and I kind of stopped getting so much out of it at a point, but it was still like really wonderful. Like I really loved hearing their stories. So I was kind of mixed feelings on this book, but I did really enjoy it, and I enjoyed what she was doing here. So 4 stars, would recommend. The final book that I finished in December was, no, not the final book. Oh my god, the penultimate book. I have so much here. Apples Never Fall by Liane Moriarty, which is an adult contemporary book about a woman who goes missing and her family search to find her. Joy Delaney is not heard from after a fight with her husband one night. She's in her 60s. Her children are all grown up and moved out, and it's kind of just no one knows what happened to her, and a lot of people think her husband killed her. And the book is largely about her and her 4 children and basically their lives, from what happened last October when she let a stranger into their home to now when she has disappeared and no one really knows what might have happened to her. I give this 4 stars. It's a very like slow, small kind of book. Like dramatic things happen, but like the biggest moments of the book are like the small moments, if that makes sense. Like the moments that matter the most to the story, to the plot, are little things that happen. It's not like the big melodramatic bits. And I really, really enjoyed that. And I loved how it made like the small things kind of the most important and really like the driving force of the story and the characters. Liane Moriarty does that a lot. Like her books border on thrillers, but then they kind of like at a point take a step back and like shrink themselves and their stories and become like very small and wonderful, and it makes me really happy. some of the characters in this book were very annoying. I'll give it that. I understand why people wouldn't like this, because it is kind of like a little bit nothing at points, but I like nothing. Nothing is fun. And I loved some of the characters. Like, Joy was so annoying. I did not like reading from her perspective. It was very frustrating. But Logan, one of her sons, was like such a complex, I mean, not even really complex. He was simple, but like real. And you could see him confronting his own flaws and like working on his own development and growth. And you could see the flaws within that growth. Like, I love when characters change in realistic ways. Like, they're not becoming a good person. They're just like realizing that they have these flaws and actively working on them throughout the book. And it was so well done here. I would have read an entire book about Logan. It made me happy. This whole book made me happy. I really like Liane Moriarty. I like her books are very enjoyable to me, but also the kind of books where like I read them once and then I will probably never think about them again, which I feel like this book does fall into. But it was enjoyable for the one-time read. And if you like Liane Moriarty, I would recommend this. And then the last book I read, an audiobook, Gulp, Adventures of the Alimentary Canal by Mary Roach, which is just a book about eating and swallowing in the digestive system and the colon and etc. I don't know. It is very similar to Stiff, where it just covers a lot of interesting topics. It's a very like journalist-centric book. Like it feels like a compilation of articles, which is very, very interesting and very enjoyable. I don't have a whole lot of interest in the digestive system, but Mary Roach makes it very interesting. I love her combination of like, she interviews scientists doing experiments, she does research into history, she like talks to people who have medical issues. Like, it's a very interesting combination of topics. I give this 4 stars. I would recommend if you're interested, if you like that kind of like journalism writing, because it was fascinating to me. It's like exactly the kind of audiobook I like listening to. Although I will say I listened to a lot of this on an overnight shift at my former job, so I was very tired while listening to some of this, so I didn't retain it as much as I would have really liked. But it was very interesting, and I would recommend. I don't have much to say. It was good. I like Mary Roach. Oh, negatives. I do think this book was trying a little too hard. Like, she was trying a little too hard to be funny and also a little too hard to, like, gross you out by talking about poop. And I was like, this is not really all that gross. Like, it's more interesting. Like, just go with the interesting bit. Like, stop trying so hard to gross me out. So that did get a little frustrating, but it was a really good book. Editing Alex here. I forgot a very important point about Gulp. The audiobook, this didn't affect my rating because it was just an audiobook issue, but the narrator for the audiobook kept doing these weird voices and terrible accents, like terrible fake accents for like everyone in the book. Like, I don't understand why they were horrible, because like Mary Roach would go and like interview some French scientist who was doing something, and the audiobook narrator would do a weird French accent that was not good. And she would do the same for like the Dutch guys or like the New York guys, or she'd just give them like a weird voice or get like super nasally, like, stop being weird, just give us the story. But that seemed like a very important note because it did very much annoy me in the book and I wanted to include it. My 3 DNFs of the month. The first book that I read and DNF'd was The End of the Twins by Saul Diskin, which is a nonfiction book about a man who is grieving for his twin brother who is diagnosed with leukemia and winds up dying from it. I got like 80 pages in, and it's not so much that this was bad. Like, it's a nonfiction book about a man who's grieving for his brother, and like very, very interesting to me in theory. But when I was reading this, it was just so dull. Like, I could never convince myself to pick this up. Like, I didn't want to hear anything about it. I didn't want to like be invested in this. Like, I just was doing so many things in order to not read this book because it was so dull, and I would just like space out on the page and have to like go back and reread sections, sometimes multiple times, because like I just could not focus on it. It was so uninteresting to me, and I feel bad, partially because it's about how his brother died, and partially because my review is the only review this book has on Goodreads, and I DNF'd it. I feel like a terrible person, but I don't know. Like, it wasn't bad. It was just so unbelievably dull. the weirdest thing is that there's nothing I can really point to that was like bad in the writing style or in the narrative, and like it was just overall so dull. Then I DNF'd Never Tear Us Apart by Monica Murphy, which is a dark new adult romance novel. It's about a girl who was kidnapped as a teenager and sexually assaulted, and now as an adult she's still dealing with that trauma. And it's also about the guy who saved her, who happens to be the son of the man who kidnapped her and sexually assaulted her. And basically, I guess they fall in love. I don't remember how far I got through this, but it was so weird and so creepy. And he was just straight up stalking her. Like, just literally following her around, stalking her. And lied to her about who he was. And, like, it was the kind of thing where I could tell, or I mean, I can't say this for sure because I didn't finish it, but, like, I could tell that they were never going to actually address the fact that he was literally stalking her. Like, it was just not going to be a thing. And also, like, their romance was so nothing. Like, they weren't, like, there was nothing built. There was nothing developed. They were just, like, instantly attracted to each other and unbelievably hot for each other. And I just, like, couldn't handle it. I was like, I don't want them to be together. They need therapy. They need to, like, this is unhealthy. I don't want them to be together. And if I don't want the main couple in a romance novel to be together, it loses all point for me. So I DNF'd, unfortunately. And then the final book that I have to talk about that I DNF'd was Best of the Wrong Reasons by Sander Santiago. This is an adult romance novel. Is it new adult or adult? I don't know. They were young adults at the very least, so let's say new adult. It was about these two boys who go back to their hometown. One of their mothers has just died, and the other one is taking care of his mother who has cancer, and they kind of rekindle their old relationship. I did actually want them to be together, because, like, they were a cute couple, but, like, there was something that was so off about this book that I can't really put my finger on, but it was kind of like the Uncanny Valley effect, where, like, it just, none of it just felt right. Like, all of it just felt kind of wrong. Like, I couldn't get into, like, the characters. I couldn't understand the relationships that were happening. And, like, I don't really understand why, but it was like I could never put my finger on what a character's relationship was to another character. They were just, like, written so weirdly, I guess, but it looked normal. It looked normal, but it felt weird reading it. And I feel like the title is an example of this. Best of the Wrong Reasons, which, like, looks normal, but, like, the more I think about it, I'm like, that is weird phrasing, and what does that mean? Like, it's not bad, and I don't actually care about the title. Like, caveat, like, the title can be whatever, I don't care. But I feel like it is kind of an example of the books where I'm just like, it looks normal, and I can't explain what's wrong with it. And I'm sure it comes from, like, a line of dialogue later on in the book, but I just can't, like, it feels weird. You know, I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. Like, it wasn't, like, a bad book. It was just, like, there was something off about it for me. And it might have just been partially because I was kind of tired of romance novels by this point. I don't know. Maybe my brain was just shutting down on romance. Because it wasn't bad. Like, I'd read romance novels earlier in the month that were worse. But, like, it was just off. So, I don't know. Those were the 25 books that I read in December. Thank you for watching. If you did watch this far, I'm sorry. This was unnecessarily long. I'm gonna try to read less in January. Read, like, a normal amount of books and not just binge things because I'm stressed and in weird moods. But as negative as this sounds, I did read a lot of books I really enjoyed. So let me know down below if you have read any of these, what you thought of them if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.